Good evening, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff_2020, and this is our backup channel, which has become our primary channel since our primary channel got terminated by YouTube about a month ago. And we've been working hard to rebuild. We've been doing summaries of the books that got taken down, and we're, of course, reading new books, as I feel that the new ones that I've got on deck for you are as important as the ones that I've already read. So I'm not going to go back and reread the books, but what I am doing is I'm starting a new series, and it's going to begin this Wednesday night with the book Crimes of Patriots by Jonathan Whitney. And what I'll be doing is every Wednesday night at 8 p.m., the show will be a book review from the book train. So it'll be a book train show Wednesday nights at 8 p.m. And what I'll do is I'll spend that hour summarizing the book as best I can, and eventually we'll get all of the different editions up. But I think I want everybody to have something that they can use to catch the basic ideas of each of the books on the book train. So that's my Wednesday night project, 8 p.m. Oh, Corky, it's not that bad. Hour of Horrors. Well, I guess, Mongrel Virginians is a pretty intimidating idea. Oh, I just got a new Patreon. Just got a notice for that. Thank you, Diane. And by the way, I'm very touched by the response to my Patreon Day request this morning. I am got a number of new Patreons. I think we're going to start recovering back up to the level where we were. And really, thank you from my emotional side, okay? Because even if you only if you give $1, it's another person in my Patreon, and it makes me feel good, So I feel good. I got a lot of good responses today, and I'll send each of you a thank you note when I can finish this show and finish a couple of other things. But I want to thank you all personally for the response to my Patreon appeal today. Mongrelization is the name of Chapter 9 of War Against the Weak. Last night, wasn't it, that we read about Margaret Sanger and her good intentions of providing birth control information and providing, an education to people as to, hey, you don't have to have 11 children. You can avoid that and still have marital relations. There's things like condoms, and that's been one of the great problems with the Catholic Church, is that they don't let you talk about contraception. I could get into the interesting questions of why is that in the context of a recent dispute between the Vatican and the Knights of Malta over that very subject of condoms. Because it seems that the Knights of Malta in Southeast Asia had started providing condoms to people, and that was a violation of the Church's long-standing prohibition against any form of contraception except for the famous rhythm method. Well, that is the answer to overpopulation. Margaret Sanger was right. if people are educated, they won't overburden themselves to make themselves, slave away for 60-hour weeks and run 3 jobs just to manage all the children. If people have education and they know that there's only so many kids that two people can manage, and really to try to help manage the size of a community or of a population generally by voluntary efforts. And we look back to Henry Kissinger's famous statements that I've been repeating lately in SSM 200 about how the third world population has to be reduced, and that has got to be our top national security project. Well, wouldn't it be easier if they didn't make so many children in the first place? But in order to achieve that, instead of educating people and giving them the devices and knowledge that they could do that on their own, it's all being forced on them through these vaccination programs that happen to have a sterilization component in them. And that sterilization is not just preventing this baby or that baby, it's preventing them from ever having babies, any babies. And that is a form of slow death of an entire nation or even racial group. So this is not all just chaotically happening. This is part of a larger, greater scheme or plan that we've been investigating. And historically, the church would kind of take that attitude of they can manage the population. And we heard from a man named Kevin Galloway a couple of months ago who reported how the church would actually spread the Black Plague in order to reduce the population in a certain area. And now, when we look at the passage of the torch of, population control away from the church to the technologists, the people that are going to do this through chemicals, through injections, through all kinds of technological means to control this population. Well, this is eugenics. And so here we are at Edwin Black's book, War Against the Weak. How America's campaign to create a master race. Yeah. Wenn the Führer says, wie ist der master race? Wie heil, right in the Führer's face. Not to love the Führer is the great disgrace. So we heil, right in the Führer's face. The old Spike Jones song. I don't know if anybody appreciated that or not, but I didn't do the strawberries or the raspberries like they do. Yeah, Spike Jones and the City Slickers did that song in the Führer's face in about 1942 or 3. For better or worse, tonight it's Q. It's Q ginger beer. That's my brand tonight. I couldn't get any Bruce Cost the past couple times I've gone to the store, and I'm doing the best I can without my usual, but I don't know about this Q stuff. I read the label, and it has a bit of a bite to it, and I thought it was the ginger, and maybe it is the ginger, but they also put some chili powder in the drink mix. Can you imagine that? So anyway, cheers. Now, Corky, I have to correct you. We're not talking about Mel Brooks. We're not talking about Springtime for Hitler. We're talking about the wonderful band of Spike Jones and his City Slickers. And their, real number, I mean, Mel Brooks is a comedian and Springtime for Hitler is a spoof, but they did that real in your face song, to Hitler during the war. So I give them much higher marks than I do to Mr. Brooks. Just to keep the record straight. Well, I'm sorry to skip the next chapter on blindness because, believe it or not, the one of the big targets of the Breeders Association, the eugenics office, the eugenicists of Cold Spring Harbor, Davenport, and the people that worked for the Carnegie Institution and the Cold Spring Harbor laboratory, which was part of Carnegie Institution at Cold Spring Harbor. Well, those people, they believe in action. They believe in sterilization. And blindness came into their sights, so to speak. Yeah, they took aim at blindness. They decided that, without any scientific basis, they just decided that blindness is hereditary. It's hereditary. And so, how do we get rid of blindness? Well, we'll do it by sterilizing blind people. Simple. That's just like, grade school logic. Of course, that's what you do. How is it possible that intelligent Americans adopted that idea? I can't fathom it. It's not at all apparent to me that blindness is a hereditary trait. I don't think it is. And then, you have all of the different eye diseases. And then you have birth defects, injuries during birth. You have all kinds of reasons that somebody couldn't see. But just because they couldn't see, they decided that these were less than the ideal human protoplasm. They always want the good protoplasm. And if you're blind, then you must have something wrong with your protoplasm. This is excuse my language, but this is fucking Harvard. These people are supposed to be smart. They are smart. But they're devilish smart. They're atheistically, no God, no reason for me to engage in treating my fellow humans as I would be treated. There's no reason for it. Because there's all the religions are just nonsense. Science is solving all of mankind's problems, and why not just let science solve this problem of blindness by sterilizing all the blind people? Well, that was a chapter that I thought I would skip to get to what I think is even a more, just completely packed with more irony and just incredibly convoluted, crazy logic. And this is the idea of mongrelization. Now, I'm going to try to say something a little bit complicated, as I sometimes do, and it has to do with the early settlement of Maryland and Virginia, where I live. And, I've studied the literature that's available, both original old stuff and archaeological texts, and a lot of just private citizens that went around and did uh, archaeological work, as well as interviewing people who are survivors from the Native Americans that lived here in Maryland and Virginia. And the Potomac River, practically outside my door here is the Great Highway, and the commerce back and forth between the sides of the Potomac was constant in the Indians' canoes, and the people of both sides were peaceful and, well, not totally peaceful, because there were Indian incursions against other Indians, like the Powhatans against the Susquehannocks, for instance, and that kind of thing. But generally, the English that came along had a very easy time with these Indians. Sometimes they fought and got killed, and sometimes they compromised, and sometimes they just vacated the area. It had a lot to do with whether the English that came were Catholic English or Protestant Calvinist English. And so you can picture that these are different on the Maryland side, which is a Catholic colony, and the Virginia side, which is Protestant. So here on the Maryland side of the Potomac, where I live, the Jesuits founded the first colony and the missions that were set up. And they set up missions in order to convert the Indians into being Christian and being part of the English civilization. And here's the important point, is that they intermarried. They intermarried just like nobility of old Europe would intermarry, not because they wanted to, because they had romantic marriage, but because it was a marriage of state. It was a marriage of political significance. And so you remember in the great story of Pocahontas and John Rolfe, that this was treated as a great accomplishment. The joinder of the Powhatan princess with the English adventurer. And then over here on the Maryland side, we had the same thing with the early Catholics marrying into the Piscataway Indian tribes, which are scattered all around here. And that was empire building. So we had, in our first contact with the English, in the contact with the Native Americans here in this area, and I'm getting to the book because this is background that I want to share with you, so that when we get to the book, it'll be part of the story. So a famous woman named Margaret Brent is said to be the first attorney, the first female attorney in Maryland, and she came from the Brent family, and the Brent family was married into the Piscataways. So to this day, if you wanted to find old Piscataway Indian blood, you might have an easier time looking in the so-called white population than you would in the black or Indian population. It's just that at that time, there was no stigma about race. You have a similar stories with black people, that before the coming of race-based slavery, which developed in the later part of the 1600s, more so in Virginia than anywhere else, but also in Maryland. But before the idea that everybody that was black had to be a slave, you had white people treated as slaves. You had black people, of course, marrying white people. And that happened here in Southern Maryland. And people don't believe it today. You tell them, well, yeah, it's true. I can give you the names and references. And they don't believe it to this day because they thought that racism existed from the beginning of time. But it didn't. And it's all part of a financial system. It was part of the financial system then that you could take people because of their skin color and abuse them and use their labor for free for life. That was part of the financial system. That's how they got free labor. It wasn't about some inherent dislike of people of different ethnicities or skin colors. It was all about how the rich got richer by exploiting poor people and then, dividing the worker class from the supervisor class, and then the servitors that Professor Hamamoto's taught us all about. All of that is all part of the financial system, how the top people keep in control. And that's exactly what Henry Kissinger's memo in SM 200 was saying, that we are much smaller in number. We use up a whole lot more assets and resources than our fair share, and we have to be vicious to keep it that way. That's the foreign policy of the United States as expounded in the early 1950s and continued to this day. That's why we have all of these ugly deals behind the scenes, because they have to exploit people in order to control them. All right, let me get to the book. But you see, what I'm setting them up for is this incredible reversal. Because here you have the most brilliant people, the Jesuits, that are actively encouraging intermarriage, conversion, and bringing the Indian people into the English society. Same thing goes on in New England with the Puritans. They want these people to become Puritans. They want them to cut their hair and become farmers. Well, that didn't work out very well, but at least we see them not being, ostracized and treated like, cattle or human accidents. Well, as I said, it's all driven by the financial needs of the elites. So now things have changed. Instead of wanting to create mutual empires with the Indians, we're now distinguishing ourselves from them. We're saying, oh no, I don't have any of that mongrel blood. And that, of course, is the story behind this chapter. The U.S. Census Bureau would not cooperate with eugenics. No agency collected and compiled more information on individuals than the Bureau of Census. Its mission was clear: to count Americans and create a demographic portrait for policymakers. A fundamental principle of census taking is the confidentiality and sanctity of individual records. In the early 20th century, American eugenics coveted this information. For years, eugenic leaders tried, with little result, to convince the Census Bureau to change its ways. They targeted the 1920 census. In 1916, Alexander Graham Bell, representing the Eugenics Record Office, was among the first to formally suggest that the Bureau add the father's name and the mother's maiden name to the data gathered on each individual. The Census Bureau declined to make the addition. But shortly after Bell's first entreaty, Laughlin proposed a survey of all those in state custodial and charitable facilities as well as jails. The Census Bureau agreed, and soon thereafter its Director of Statistical Research, Joseph Hill, granted Laughlin the assignment. Laughlin was credentialed as Special Agent of the Bureau of the Census. This first joint program, however, would not lead to an alliance with the Census Bureau, but to a bureaucratic war. Since the 1880s, the Census Bureau had compiled statistics on what it called, quote, the defective, the dependent, and delinquent population, referring to the insane as defective, the elderly and infirm as dependent, and prisoners as delinquent. Laughlin, and this is one of the people that works with Davenport at Cold Spring Harbor, and he was introduced in the chapter I didn't read. Laughlin insisted on charging the Census Bureau's changing the terminology to socially inadequate and adding to its roles large stratified contingents of the unfit, especially along racial lines. Laughlin's concept of social inadequacy would encompass those who, quote, entail a drag upon those members of the community who have sufficient insight, initiative, competence, physical strength, and social instincts to enable them to live effective lives. The Census Bureau refused. It stubbornly claimed that Laughlin's newly concocted term, socially inadequate, if used publicly, would surely call forth criticism and protest. A war of nomenclature erupted, and Laughlin, described as a tempest in a teapot, raged for more than 2 years. Unwilling to back down, Laughlin consulted his bevy of experts and then, disregarding any direction from the Census Bureau, employed the term socially inadequate anyway when he sent his request to 576 state and federal institutions. Although the outbreak of World War I interrupted the project, in May of 1919 the Bureau finalized and then published Laughlin's work under the title it chose, Statistical Directory of State Institutions for the Defective, Dependent, and Delinquent Classes. Following this irksome years-long experience, the Census Bureau refused all but cosmetic cooperation with eugenicists. Laughlin, in his capacity as Secretary of the Eugenics Research Association, wrote to Samuel Rogers, Director of the Census, in 1918, asking if the Bureau planned to identify 9 classes of, quote, socially inadequates. Rogers formally replied that no such data would be gathered except the names and addresses of the deaf and blind, as previously collected. At a 1919 conference, the ERA Executive Committee decided to try to convince the Census Bureau to conduct a, quote, experimental genealogical survey of a selected community, unquote. 3 days later, they petitioned Census Bureau Director Rogers to add 2 columns titled Ancestry to the paper questionnaires or enumeration sheets. In the interest of race betterment, unquote, the 2 new columns, to be situated between the existing columns, would identify the mother by maiden name and the father. Family ties would be established, and thus all census enumeration records would become available for genealogical and family pedigree studies. The ERA predicted that these records would constitute the greatest and most valuable genealogical source in the world. Writing in the Journal of Heredity, Laughlin advanced the 2 additional columns so that any individual could be located from census to census and generation to generation. Isn't it interesting that this is 100 years ago and they are proposing things that violate the Census Bureau's rules and their sense of decorum, that no, and plus the logic is you have to promise people anonymity or they won't give you honest data. So now they've got all this data, and these eugenicists, of course, they've got a theory in search of proof. So they want to mine the data to prove their theories, but the Census Bureau won't let them because of privacy. Now think about today. What's going on right now is the entire, all of our records of everything are now becoming made available to more and more people. And, who knows that the NSA doesn't have all of my medical records from my birth to now. I don't have them, but, they're still incentivized to learn everything they can about each of us and then to construct their theories or to support their theories using the data that they collect. But that's what I'm saying, is that they're trying to destroy our individual rights and our privacy. Well, I'm going to move on to the next section here. It's at page 161, and it's about Virginia in particular. And there's this man named Walter Ashby Plecker, and he considered himself a product of the Civil War, even though he was born in 1861, just as the conflict began. His memories of his youth during the Reconstruction years were greatly influenced by a beloved Negro family servant named Delia. And Delia represented the emotional strength of his whole family. As was common, she essentially raised Plecker as a young boy, exercising extensive control over his activities and earning his lasting gratitude. Plecker's sister sobbed at Delia's wedding at the thought of losing the connection, and Delia broke down as well. When Plecker's mother fell ill for the last time, she sent for Delia to nurse her back to health if possible. In his mother's final hour, it was Delia who comforted her at her deathbed, and when the moment came, it was Delia who tenderly placed her fingers on the woman's eyelids and shut them for the last time. No wonder Delia was remembered in the mother's will. No wonder that Plecker, as executor of his mother's estate, warmly wrote the first bequest check to Delia. From Plecker's point of view, Delia was family. Fond memories of Delia did not prevent Walter A. Plecker from becoming a fervent raceologist and eugenicist. He detested the notion of racial and social mixing in any form. His obsession with white racial purity would turn him into America's preeminent demographic hunter of blacks, American Indians, and other people of color. In the process, Plecker fortified Virginia as the nation's bastion of eugenic racial salvation. Plecker's fanaticism propelled him into a lifelong crusade to codify the existence of just 2 races, white and everything else. Plecker began his career in medicine, receiving a degree from the University of Maryland at Baltimore, and then continuing in obstetrics at the New York Polyclinic. He opened a practice in Virginia and quickly became involved with family records, at one point serving as a pension examiner. Plecker moved his practice to Birmingham, Alabama for several years, but soon returned to his beloved Virginia. He settled in Elizabeth City County, one of the 8 original Virginia shires created in 1634. Elizabeth City County was intensely proud of its genealogical heritage. The historic county's citizens included many so-called first families of Virginia, that is, the colonial settlers. You ever heard that, the FFV? Meticulous family records had been kept, but were in large part destroyed during the numerous battles and town burnings of the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Civil War. After the Civil War, Elizabeth City County meticulously restored and reorganized its population records. In 1900, Elizabeth City County created a health department, along with a section of vital statistics to document births and deaths. A few years later, Plecker was hired as a county health officer, where he fastidiously recorded life cycle events. One tri-racial Hampton, Virginia family that he first encountered in 1905 made quite an impact on him. After delivering their baby boy, Plecker at bedside registered the mother's racially mixed marriage. Plecker was appalled by the racial permissiveness of Virginia's system. Later, when Plecker observed a local Negro death rate twice that of whites, he began to investigate, pursuing a goal of, quote, near 100% registration of births and deaths. Population statistics and registration became more than a fascination, they became his mission. His proficiency at registering citizens made Plecker a natural pick in 1912 to help draft the state's new law, creating the Bureau of Vital Statistics. Plecker was invited to head the new agency as registrar and to set his own salary. He was so dedicated that he magnanimously asked for little more than subsistence. Virginia's 1912 statute established registration of the state's citizens by race, without clear definitions. Yet for 300 years, Virginia had produced racially mixed citizens by virtue of the state's original colonial settlement, its indigenous Indian population, a thriving slave system, and waves of European immigration. But a desire for general population registration was not what drove Plecker. He was hardly devoted to the statistical sciences. He was simply a racist. Plecker's passion was for keeping the white race pure from any possible mixture with black, American Indian, or Asian blood. The only real goal of bureaucratic registration was to prevent racially mixed marriages and social mixing, to biologically barricade the white race in Virginia. In an official Virginia State Health Bureau pamphlet, Plecker declared, quote, "The white race in this land is the foundation upon which rests its civilization, and is responsible for the leading position which we occupy amongst the nations of the world. Is it not therefore just and right that this race decide for itself what its composition shall be, and attempt, as Virginia has, to maintain its purity?" Plecker was no authority on eugenics, however. He was a proud member of the Eugenics Society, but that required no scientific expertise. Years after he became a leading exponent of eugenic raceology, Plecker wrote to Laughlin for advice on race-mixing formulas and confided, quote, "I'm not satisfied with the accuracy of my own knowledge as to the result of racial intermixture with repeated white crossings." He added that he didn't understand Davenport's complex protoplasmic discussion of skin color, explaining, "I've never felt justified in believing that the children of mulattoes are really white." under Mendel's laws. Although he cloaked his crusade under the mantle of eugenics science, Plecker did not mind confessing his real motive. While we are interested in the eugenical records of our citizens, Plecker wrote, we are attempting to list only the mixed breeds who are endeavoring to pass into the white race. In other words, Plecker could not be distracted with formulas and charts tracing a spectrum of racial and subracial lineages. In Virginia, you were either ancestrally white or you weren't. Plecker planned to add the names of all epileptics, insane, feeble-minded, and criminals, which would be gathered from the state's hospitals, prisons, bureaus, and county clerks, bestowing on Virginia a massive eugenical database that would reach back to the first white footfalls on Virginia's soil. The purpose will be to list degenerates and criminals, he assured. Of course, the ERO was also assembling hundreds of thousands of names, but its extensive rolls only amounted to a patchwork of lineages, from counties speckled across the country. Plecker's vision would deliver America's first statewide eugenic registry, a real one. Plecker's true passion never varied. It was always about preserving the purity of the white race. Millions of inscribed linen pages and thousands of leather-bound volumes could be filled, but Plecker would never achieve his real goal without dramatic legislative changes. Existing state laws outlawing mixed-race marriages were simply too permissive. In the first place, most states varied on what exactly constituted a Negro or a colored person. At least 6 states forbade whites from marrying half Negroes or mulattoes. Nearly a dozen states prohibited whites from marrying those of 1/4 or even 1/8 Negro ancestry. Others were simply vague. Virginia's own blurred statutes had allowed extensive intermarriage throughout the generations between whites and light-skinned Negroes, white, Indian, Negro, triracials, mulattoes, and others. Plecker and the ERO called this practice the mongrelization of Virginia's white race. Pardon me. To halt mongrelization, a coalition of Virginia's most powerful whites organized a campaign to create the nation's stiffest marriage restriction law. It would ban marriage between a certified white person and anyone with even, quote, 1 drop, unquote, of non-Caucasian blood. The key would be mandatory statewide registration of all persons under Plecker's purview as registrar of the Bureau of Vital Statistics. Leading the charge for the new legislation were Plecker and his 2 friends, John Powell and Ernest Cox. Powell was one of Virginia's most esteemed composers and concert pianists. Ironically, he built his musical reputation on performing his, quote, Rhapsodie Negre, which wove Negro themes and spirituals into a popular sonata form. Later, as Powell became more race-conscious, he claimed that Negroes had stolen their music from the, quote, compositions of white men, unquote. Powell decried the American melting pot as, quote, a witch's cauldron. Cox led the White America Society and authored the popular racist book White America, 1923, which warned of the mongrelization of the nation. Plecker, Cox, and Powell created a small but potent white supremacist league known as the Anglo-Saxon Clubs, which would become pivotal in the registration crusade. Despite their virulent racism, the Anglo-Saxon clubs claimed they harbored no ill will toward Negroes. Why? Because now it was just science, eugenic science. The Anglo-Saxon clubs could boast, quote, "One drop of Negro blood makes the Negro," is no longer a theory based on race pride or color prejudice, but a logically induced scientific fact. As such, even the group's constitution proclaimed its desire for the supremacy of the white race in the United States of America without racial prejudice or hatred. This was the powerful redefining nature of eugenics in action. The Anglo-Saxon clubs and their loose confederation of local branches successfully petitioned the General Assembly and brought about Senate Bill 219 and House Bill 311, each captioned, "An Act to Preserve Racial Integrity." This is 1921 or so, Art and Yoga. The legislation would require all Virginians to register their race and defined whites as those with no trace whatsoever of any blood other than Caucasian, unquote. Each person not already booked in the Vital Statistics Bureau will be required to take out a sort of passport, correctly setting forth his racial composition. This passport or certificate would be required before any marriage license could be granted. Pure whites could only marry pure whites. All other race combinations would be allowed to intermarry freely. The Anglo-Saxon clubs found a powerful ally in their campaign. The state's leading newspaper, the Richmond Times-Dispatch, allowed its pages to become a megaphone for the legislation. In July of 1923, Cox and Powell published side-by-side articles entitled, quote, "Is White America to become a Negroid nation?" The men claimed that proposed legislation was based on sound Mendelian eugenics that now conclusively proved that when two human varieties mixed, quote, "the more primitive always dominates in the hybrid offspring," unquote. Despite the bill's popular appeal, legislators were unwilling to ratify the measure without two adjustments. First, the notion of mandatory registration was considered an insult to the white people of the state. Plecker confided to a minister, "The legislature was about to vote the whole measure down when we offered it, making registration optional. Mandatory registration was deleted from the bill. Second, a racial loophole was permitted, this to accommodate the oldest and most revered Virginia families who proudly boasted of descending from pre-colonial Indians, including Pocahontas. Plecker's original proposal only allowed those with 1/64th Indian blood or less to be registered as white. This was broadened by the senators to 1/16th Indian blood, with the understanding that many of Virginia's finest lineages included 18th and 19th century Indian ancestors. Virginia's Racial Integrity Act was ratified on March 8, 1924, and became effective on June 15th. Falsely registering one's race was defined as a felony, punishable by 1 year in prison. Plecker began circulating bulletins. The first went out in March of 1924, under the insignia of the Virginia Department of Health, and entitled "To Preserve Racial Integrity." He laid out strict instructions to all local registrars and other government officials throughout the state. Quote, "As color is the most important feature of this form of registration, the local registrar must be sure that there is no trace of colored blood in anyone offering to register as a white person. The penalty for willfully making a false claim to color as is 1 year in the penitentiary. The clerk must also decide the question of color before he can issue a marriage license. You should warn any person of mixed or doubtful color as to the risk of making a claim as to his color if it is afterwards found to be false. April 30th, 1924, to Mrs. Robert H. Chatham, Lynchburg, Virginia. We have a report of the birth of your child, July 30th, 1923, signed by Mary Gilden, midwife. She says you are white and that the father of the child is white. We have a correction to this certificate sent to us from the City Health Department at Lynchburg, in which they say that the father of this child is a Negro. This is to give you warning that this is a mulatto child, and you cannot pass it off as white. A new law passed by the last legislature says that if a child has 1 drop of Negro blood, it cannot be counted as white. You will have to do something about this matter and see that this child is not allowed to mix with white children. It cannot go to white schools and can never marry a white person in Virginia. It is an awful thing. Yours very truly, W.A. Plecker, Virginia State Registrar. Plecker's friend Powell of the Anglo-Saxons clubs was copied on both letters. A small handwritten notation at the top left read, "Dear Mr. Powell, this is a specimen of our daily troubles and how we are handling them." Well, I'm going to skip through a couple more anecdotes of how this racist was able to manipulate Virginia laws, and the population of Virginia got divided into 2 races, white and everything else. And the 1-drop blood rule came along and was enforced. Loving versus Virginia, the famous Supreme Court case. And when was that? In the 60s, I think. Anyway, finally, this law was turned over, but it wasn't until like 40 years later. I'm going to skip to the last part of this chapter because I want to mention this book that is in fact called Mongrel Virginians. Plecker employed his usual tactics in erasing Indian as a racial category from the state's records. He sarcastically accused one Indian family in Rockbridge County of having a bloodline that included several Indians who had intermarried with some whites and Negroes. He instructed local registrar Aileen Goodman to change their classification to colored, and brashly notified the accused individual that in the future no clerk in Virginia is permitted to issue a marriage license to persons of mixed descent with white people, and our Bureau expects to make it very plain that this law must be absolutely enforced. The Rockbridge family members were no longer Indians. Even when no Negro bloodline was apparent, Plecker was adamant. He identified one man in Lexington, Virginia, as 1/4 Indian, 3/4 white, who cannot be distinguished from a white man. He attended one of the colleges of Virginia, studied law, and married into a good family in Rockbridge County. There are several similar cases in southwest Virginia, where Indians have married white women and their children are passing as white. He informed the local registrar, "You see to it that the mixed people of your territory are registered as either colored or, quote, free issue." Disallowing even the category mixed Indian, Plecker instructed the term mixed without the word Indian after it might be acceptable, but we would prefer other terms. The Lexington, Virginia family members were no longer Indians. At one point, Plecker visited an Indian church following its Sunday service, and after 2 hours, sternly informed the assembled that no matter how they protested, they would be registered as colored and would continue to be so, and that none of them would be considered anything else. Some years later, when the church clerk of Charles City County tried to issue a marriage license to a member of the church, and even included the birth certificate attesting to the man's white lineage, Plecker simply changed the records. Quote, "We received this record for this birth with both parents given as white. Of course we will not accept the certificate in that way. All of the Adkins group and other associated with them, under their Chickahominy charter, are classified in our office as colored, and never as white or Indian." Plecker's influence extended even beyond Virginia. For example, Plecker wrote to William Bradby of Detroit, Michigan, advising that his birth certificate claiming to be of half-breed Indian parentage would be disallowed. Leaving no room for argument, Plecker declared simply, "We do not recognize any native-born Indian as of pure Indian descent, unmixed with Negro blood." To bolster his assertion that Indians simply no longer existed, only mongrel mixtures, Plecker turned for scientific support to the Carnegie Institution and its Eugenics Records Office. For years prior to the passage of Virginia's Racial Integrity Act, the ERO had focused on the Indians of Virginia as examples of the unfit. In 1926, the Carnegie Institution financed and published the results of an extensive field work by 2 of its Virginia researchers, who had examined some 500 tribal members in one area. The Carnegie Institution's book, printed under its own imprimatur, with Davenport's close supervision, was entitled Mongrel Virginians. Mongrel Virginians was heralded for its academic completeness. It asserted that all living descendants of the several hundred Indians in question have been visited time and again by one or both of the authors. In addition, every known white, colored, or Indian person in the county, state, or nation who could furnish information concerning the deceased or living has been consulted and asked to give any material of value to the investigation. The Carnegie report lumped all of these Indians into one new group, which they called the, quote, Win tribe, W-I-N. Indeed, the subtitle of Mongrel Virginians was the Win tribe. No one had ever heard of a Win tribe prior to this volume. The book explained Win stood for White, Indian, Negro. The Wins themselves claim to be of Indian descent, the book asserted. They are described variously as low-down yellow Negroes, as Indians, and as mixed. No one, however, speaks of them as white. The Wins themselves in general claim that Indian descent, although most of them realize they are mixed, preferring to speak of the Indian rather than of the possibility of a Negro mixture in them. The Carnegie report assessed their usefulness to society as follows. Quote, "It is evident from this study that the intellectual levels of the Negro and the Indian race as now found is below the average for the white race. In the Wins, the early white stock was probably at least of normal ability, that is, for the white. Today, however, the whole Win tribe is below the average mentally and socially. They are lacking in academic ability, industrious to a very limited degree, and capable of taking little training. Some of them do rather well with the few things they know, such as raising tobacco or corn, a few as carpenters or bricklayers, but this has been the result of years of persistent supervision by the white landlords. Less than a dozen men work even reasonably well without a foreman. Very few could tell the value of either 25 or 75 cents. Nor did the Carnegie Report find redeeming qualities in the Indian culture it described. Quote, and they have no sense of rhythm, even in their lighter mulatto mixtures. As is well known, the Negro is full of music, but no one has ever shown any semblance of ability in that line. No mention was made of the Indians' legendary rhythmic dances or songs and their many drums and other musical instruments. Mongrel Virginians was accorded credibility because of its prestigious authorship and its touted academic rigor. Plecker seized on Mongrel Virginians to prove his point and help him reclassify Indians. He helped popularize the book around the state with his own enthusiastic reviews. Despite Mongrel Virginians, Indians and others fought back. Several sued Plecker and made substantial progress in the courts. As early as November 1924, one judge by the name of Henry Holt ruled against Plecker. Quote, in 25 generations, one has 32 millions of grandfathers, not to speak of grandmothers, assuming there is no intermarriage. Half of the men who fought at Hastings were my grandfathers. Some of them were probably hanged, some knighted. Who can tell? Certainly, in some instances, there was an alien strain. Beyond peradventure, I cannot prove that there was not. Nor could the judge find any two ethnologic authorities who could agree on the definition of pure Caucasian. Well, I see I'm past 9 o'clock, so I'm going to wrap it up here. But the point is that they were trying to advance the cause of eugenics by lumping anybody that's not pure white into this big category called colored, or in this instance, the WINs, the white Indian Negroes, and thereby support with those distinctions their theory that the white Anglo-Saxon elite families are, in fact, a superior race. I'll see you tomorrow.